man, and welcome to Visited by Voices.
Lauren says, please sing Cher's Life After Love. No.
Welcome back to Visited by Voices Live on a Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and a lot of different times around the world. I'm joined today, as usual, by my co-host, Sam.
What up, y'all?
I don't know, what is up, y'all?
Oh, I became an aunt like a few hours ago. My stepsister had her baby.
Well, congratulations. Does the baby have a name?
Susie Marie.
Susie Marie.
Mm-hmm. And my dad is a grandfather now, so it's like, I'm going to rag on him for that. It's going to be awesome.
Absolutely.
But everybody's doing well, so very exciting.
That is incredible. That is amazing. I don't like children, but that's still amazing anyway. We're also joined today by author Tommy B. Smith, author of Anybody Want to Play War, The Mourner's Cradle, Pieces of Chaos, and Poisonous, as well as more than a couple dozen short stories. How are you, Tommy?
I'm good. It could definitely be worse. So it's Friday, so that's all.
Give it some time. You're on Visited by Voices. It almost certainly will get worse.
Well,
I'm having a good day. Don't scare him away, Lauren.
Don't worry. He has something to sell. He's not going anywhere. So I met Tommy at the Imaginarium Con on the very last wraparound through the con before I left early like you weren't supposed to if you had another panel later in the day. So I got to tell you, the weekend was, as I've just expressed to people here, it was not the best weekend at a con for me ever, except meeting up with some great friends and going bowling and hanging out for a while. But that last time through the dealer room and at the tables talking to the writers on that last pass through, that was incredible. I wish the whole weekend could have been like that. And quite literally, the last place I hit on the way out was Tommy's table, where I believe I handed him a card. We had a conversation about the show, and I bought a book, and we are here talking now. So I just wanted to let everyone know that Tommy won the award that was presented at Imaginarium in 2020. Pronounce that for me, Tommy.
Imagine.
It's just Imagine. It's spelled really funky. It's spelled like
I'm a
genie. Yeah. Yes. He won that for best literary novel, which is getting to the point of one of the things that makes him special in the scene, which is that he doesn't only write genre work, he also writes more mainstream literary fare as well. And that breadth of work is refreshing, really. Usually when people cross genre, they tend to go more towards other more comfortable places, whether it be romance or mystery or science fiction. But you swung for the fences, sir.
I tried. It was different. It was a different direction for me, sort of a crossroads writing-wise. But I went with a story that met me headlong and seemed to present itself as the story that demanded to be written first. So seems like I always have, a number of kettles boiling, and that was the one that was ready to be pulled off the stove and poured into the reader's minds. So ready for me to write. So it was a different sort of story, but it was very much more a character-driven story, and ended up not being a horror story somehow. But it was a literary fiction story, as it might be written by someone who otherwise typically writes horror.
Yeah, I do think the genre does inform work even when you work outside of it, doesn't it? I mean, once you get bit by the bug, there's not really a going back.
Oh, I'll definitely go back to horror, of course. That's typical, and in general, just whatever I want to write. I mean, dark fiction. I've used that umbrella term, um, just to tell a story, and it comes out being either horror or something horror-ish or something in that blanket of dark fiction. That, as once upon a time, I wrote some more short stories, but fantasy. Once upon a time, I started out writing horror and fantasy uh, with short stories, and some of my fantasy short stories came across to a lot of the publications at the time as being way too dark. And I even saved a rejection, one of those. I sort of took it as a compliment. Your work is entirely too dark for us. So and so dies, this happens, and then this happens, and these people die. It's a little dark for us. I said, well, that's fine. I'm fine with having a story rejected for that. So, but then I got more appreciation from the horror community at that time. I sort of gravitated toward more the horror side of it.
Well, it's funny because I think that rejection is one of those things that hurts in the beginning, but over time you start to realize that if it wasn't right, it was the best thing that could have happened. Because if you're in the wrong place and you get no notice for it, it's the tree falling in the woods, right? So,
I mean, yeah, and if you're getting multiple rejections, perhaps if you're getting feedback, sometimes that's helpful. Perhaps you're not doing everything perfectly, because none of us are perfect. And also because as an author, what we're looking at page by page as we pen the story is going to be different from what the reader or an editor or a beta reader is going to see on the other side of that lens. They're viewing the story through a very different perspective. And some of that feedback can be helpful to us. But sometimes if something's not right and multiple editors are rejecting your story, perhaps it's time for a rework or to step back and appraise what you've done, or any number of directions you might go from there. But it's not the end of the world, certainly. It's just another step in the process.
yeah, we've all written that story or longer than just that story that just is going nowhere, and it's our own damn fault, and that's okay because it's part of the learning. It's part of the learning curve that we all have to go on.
Lauren, which book did you pick up at Imaginarium?
Poisonous, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Nice.
That was the most...
I'm working through Pieces of Chaos right now, so.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, that one's super fun. It's just like little bite-size short, like little short story blurbs, I want to say, because they're just kind of, just moments in time almost. And it's just like I can just take a break and read one of those, and then go back to working my regular day job, and it's just perfect, like just perfect things. But I really liked Chronicle of the Golden Pyramid. I thought that struck me as really dark, more so the obsession that led the main character to decide to take all those sleeping pills. And I could see where that was really dark.
I wrote that during an interesting time. That was actually some of the early short stories, or that was among some of the early short stories I wrote and had published back in 2007. So yeah, that was during a time period when I really wouldn't leave the house or associate with anyone, and things are completely different these days. I get out and do a lot of events, conventions, and what have you. But at that time, I was a new writer, and I wrote things like that. But yeah, I do have sometimes people ask me questions about some of those, and some of those stories are a little darker than some of the stories even I wrote later on. So
yeah, I think it wasn't. What struck me wasn't the surrealness of being transported to the Golden Pyramid, although that's an amazing visual. It was just kind of that descent into obsession. That was probably the most frightening part for me. So I mean, I loved it. I thought that was so far. That's been my favorite one so far. Although I just got done with the Epitaph of Saul, and that one I'm gonna have to go back and reread and digest some more, because I think there's a lot more layers to it that I'm missing. So very cool.
Yeah, thank you. And that one was inspired by historical events.
Yes. Oh yeah, the ergot, and I don't really see ergot show up in a lot of writing. I don't, maybe it's just because I don't read enough, but I think I only started hearing about ergot within the last few months.
To me, it was interesting reading about that. It was in the Berkeley research. I was reading the stories about in the Middle Ages, and of course, the people, many of the people who were not as well off were eating rye bread, and of course they were unaware that ergot poisoning was affecting the rye crops and consuming them, and people were consumed with mass hallucinations, and entire villages being devoured by madness, people seeing dragons, demons, people hurling themselves out of windows, all sorts of craziness. At the time, they really didn't understand, so I wanted to capture what they may have thought of it at that time. They may have attributed it to religious beliefs or to who knows what, superstition, because their science at that time was not what we have today. So they really had no idea.
I'm just waiting for the next brunch fad to be ergot toast. Now, avocado toast can fuck right off.
That would be interesting.
Toast, make those brunches really fun.
You could argue that society has built itself off of delusions from a time when we didn't understand delusion. Because it's kind of like the longest game of elephant ever, right? Or telephone, depending on where you are in the country. Whereas, one kid whispers a word or a sentence into the next kid's ear, and it goes on until it turns into something completely different. Certainly, at a less enlightened time, any number of things that cause delusions, whether magic mushrooms or rotting rye bread, could have led us where we are today culturally, which is fascinating.
And it's such a fucking bummer because rye bread is delicious.
It is.
It's like one of my favorite kinds of bread. Not my favorite carb. Pasta's way up there.
Oh no, you're just wrong. Rice all the way.
Rice is great. I love rice too. It's just a step below pasta. That's all.
So we are now 13 minutes. Barley.
Here you go.
We're 13 minutes in the show and I haven't asked the first question yet, so that's always a good sign. Where we always start. How did you get bit by the horror bug? Do you have a memory of when the appeal started?
Well, the farthest back I remember being affected by horror was in my own nightmares. And that at the time was very scary. But I was very young and impressionable as a child. And I really didn't have a lot of, as a matter of fact, I was probably over imaginative to the extent and didn't have the amount of control to sort of make sense of it. When you're very young and you don't know where the world begins and ends, it's such a massive place, the universe, and such a lack of understanding. That just my attempts to make something of the world and of that between the lines that would come to me in my dreams. But then down the years, though, I started reading, and of course I enjoyed a lot of the old horror movies from back in that time. Which you spoke at one point of the early 80s. I enjoyed the old 80s slashers and what have you. And some of that influenced Poisonous. And of course, Halloween was a big one of my favorites. And I also read a lot of books. There was a big dusty utility room. At that time, we didn't have the internet. So I read quite a bit. And we had a dusty utility room full of books. And there were all sorts of books. John Coyne was a horror author. I don't know that he writes horror anymore, but we had some of his, and then we had some of Stephen King's earlier works, and I think there was I remember an anthology, possibly two, of some Alfred Hitchcock short stories, and just all sorts of there were short story collections as well, and there were fantasy stories and what have you mixed in with all of that. But so I read quite a bit, and so that's between all of that, I guess, is what happened.
Dan out in the chat has a question. Tommy, I recently picked up the Mourner's Cradle. Can you tell us a little bit about the story?
Yes, thank you, Daniel. That was a story that came about. Poisonous was actually the first book to come out, but the Mourner's Cradle is set in St. Charles, which is also the setting for Poisonous, but in 1979, where it has become the tainted sort of city that it is. And the Mourner's Cradle is a story of grief and loss and the struggle to overcome. And it begins as a bit more of a character-driven story in Anne Sharp, and she awakens in an empty bed, empty aside from her, and on the other side is the empty spot where her husband would normally be lying, and he isn't there anymore. And so she's left with this house full of things they shared that are really nothing more than things, remnants now. And so he was an independent researcher, her husband, Damon Sharp, and there are a number of loose ends. He had someone who was what you might call an enemy, and there was a lot of loose-ended research. And also during their marriage, he spent the last couple of years of their marriage obsessing about this idea of the mourner's cradle to be perhaps a hidden graveyard, lost to history, and he's only found scant clues of it from South American lore and in specific Peru, so relating to ancient civilizations. So she takes up his obsession. She becomes obsessed because she wants to know why. Why did this destroy their marriage? Why? And most of all, she's angry about his death. And so her way of lashing out is to take this up and to find out why, to ask that question why, and to go to Peru for herself to gather all of his materials. And so that launches, and some people have tried to call this a thriller. In some aspects it is, but it is a horror story at its core. Someone else described it as quiet horror. So
it's funny because, and my apologies to everyone who's hearing this for the millionth time, but I think that in the current cycle of powerful horror novels and stories and the rebirth of the Gothic, that is, over the last few years, definitely taken over, the mass market side of horror. Grief is actually the most common subject or emotion that's being explored in horror today. It's fascinating because you wouldn't have expected it coming through, in film, the James Wan's, jump scare world, whereas literary horror is starting to explore the idea that we've lost something profound, and as a people, and the individual stories are kind of like the microcosm, and then there's this hidden macrocosm inside the zeitgeist of horror, of that, and it all seems to rotate around grief, which I think it's fascinating that so many writers are coming to that middle ground at the same time. There's definitely something afoot.
there is, and also going back to Imaginarium convention, I picked up a book from another author whom I met there and spoke with, and also shared a panel with, Laurel Hightower. She wrote a book, Crossroads, and that's it's a novella, yet it's a tremendous book. So I would recommend anyone interested in that type of horror to check that out as well. I just finished it, actually. But yes, there are definite themes of grief prevalent in that one as well.
It seems every time I pick up a new horror novel, it's there somewhere. And that wasn't always the case. You read a lot of that 70s, 80s King wave. There's very little grief in that. I mean, maybe a little bit in Pet Sematary is the big example people would throw at me to contradict me. But if you look at the movement as a whole, in the John Sauls and the Robert McCammons, grief is not central. And we are there now. So I think that's an interesting movement that probably is worth a little bit of introspection. So I wanted to ask about your influences. You mentioned King in passing, and I think that's the one everyone kind of goes to as middle ground. But who else was an early influence that helped you decide you wanted to do this?
Well, it really seems to have been across the board, but I was a big fan of the Twilight Zone when I was writing the short stories, and for all those years, and some of those went into Pieces of Chaos. It was more sort of about weird fiction, and not necessarily, when people say weird fiction, they mean Lovecraftian. Not necessarily Lovecraftian, but weird is in blurring the lines between this world and the next, and what is considered to be ordinary is perhaps not as ordinary as we think when we look more deeply. And I enjoyed, like I said, John Coyne. I read some of his books. I actually read some science fiction at that time. Those were some, and even some fantasy as well. I mean, I read, and it's going to, people knowing I'm a horror author and then hearing a variety of different influences, I don't know how often that makes sense. But I remember reading Tolkien, and I remember reading Powell Anderson, and I remember reading, but then, of course, as you said, Stephen King, and then, of course, Clive Barker is just awesome. So, but I read, and, over the years, I suppose, there may even have been newer authors that we all sort of influence each other, I suppose. So,
I wanted to, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Nope.
No, I'm pretty much done.
Well, I wanted to
I
ask
could
you
go on
about.
and on and on. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to ask you about when you were referring to, having dreams when you were younger. Do you remember your earliest dream or nightmare or anything like that?
Well, I remember I had a series of nightmares, and oddly, some people are going to laugh. It seems a bit cliche, but this is before It or anything came out. But yeah, there was people with painted faces like clowns, and an operating table, and it recurred many times. I would be naked and being held down to this operating table, and the people resembled clowns, and like I said, and I don't remember whether, other than actual serial killers, of course, prior to that, whether clowns were prominent in fiction at that time. Like I said, It hadn't been out yet, but so I kept having these dreams. I kept having these odd, yeah, over and over and over again, and that was sort of, if you read Poisonous and you read the first chapter, there's an operating table and an individual painted with a clown's face, and so that came from that all those years ago, but so
yeah, your subconscious is fucking terrifying.
it was to me at the time.
No, it's still terrifying. You're good. It's still scary. That's a great mishmash of two tropes about, it's like the people that we entrust to act one way, acting the other way. We essentially, we put our lives in the hands of doctors and nurses. And then we also don't usually, well, now we expect clowns to be evil, but that's a generational thing. But, in the before times when everything was still relatively normal, it's like, oh, clowns are there to make you laugh. Oh, no, they're just going to cut me open. Great.
Yes.
What the dude? That's scary shit. I'm good. I don't want to live in your subconscious. No offense. I got enough crazy shit.
And then there was a time period that I was in the hospital for a long time, and people are coming around trying to stick me with needles all the time, and so that may have factored in. I was very young when that happened as well.
Ugh, that's rough.
So.
Griffin in the chat has a question. Tom mentions you love the original Twilight Zone series. Was he a fan of Richard Matheson's printed work?
Printed work, yes. I Am Legend, of course. That's legendary. I've read some of his short stories. Richard Matheson has done a lot of awesome things. So yes, definitely.
A god among writers. No other way to put it. No other way.
And Hell House, and another awesome one.
There's that quote, and I'm going to butcher it, so I apologize in advance, that Matheson, I think it was the foreword to Dark Forces, said that when Stephen King started to break, he was happy because he could finally retire, because he could pass the baton to someone. And what an amazing, amazing concept.
Excellent, yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the difference between your approach to writing a novel versus writing a short story, because the forms are very different. Certainly the workload difference of getting so much successfully into so small amount of real estate presents a challenge for short stories, but also the depth you need for a novel and the density to be successful. They're both different challenges. Is there one that you prefer? Obviously, you used to write a lot more short stories at the beginning of your career than you do now. I think that's kind of normal because it's a great place to learn, but tell us about how you feel about the two forms.
Yeah, you're pretty spot on with that. I mean, I did start out writing a lot of short stories, and it was, I heard something once upon a time, which later turned out to be complete bullshit, but nonetheless, it galvanized me to write some short stories, and that's that many authors start out, selling their short stories, and then basically the idea that you have to sell some short stories before you have a chance at getting a book published. And this is way back when. And but what the short stories did accomplish for me is helping to hone my craft, helping to find stories that would fit neatly into some of these publications and webzines and magazines and anthologies and all of that, and just to improve upon what I was trying to do at the time. And so I think my writing is a bit tighter and cleaner as a result of being a short story writer first. But I always enjoyed the freedom to hop around between different worlds, ideas, concepts, and characters with a short story. I mean, I can tell so many different stories, so many different kinds of stories Whereas when I sit down to write a book, it's a really immersive experience, and I'm digging deep into that world and deeper and deeper and deeper. Sometimes it's nice to sit back and just talk about a lot of different things rather than one thing for a really long time, if you want to consider it as a conversation between the reader and the author.
It's like sliders versus a hamburger.
Except
look, there's a fajita Friday, and I know they're cooking downstairs. My mind is thinking about fajitas also.
There you go.
My bad.
So, have you done a lot of novella work, which is that weird middle ground that seems to be growing more and more popular?
I've been thinking about it because, I do enjoy the form. I enjoy reading novellas. I think that length lends itself well to horror. I've read a lot of really excellent horror novellas. Like I said, the one I just mentioned, Crossroads by Laurel Hightower, that's actually a novella. Poisonous was a novella. But there are a lot of other ones that I've really enjoyed at that length. Sometimes you really don't need 100,000 words to tell a story.
I would argue that very few stories actually need 100,000 words. Inside the genre, anyway. There comes a point where I think you're just being grand to be grand.
It could be, yeah. But I definitely enjoy novellas. I enjoy reading them and writing them, and I've considered doing another one down the line at some point. It could be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think it's a very powerful form for the genre, and I'd like to see a more obvious way for it to be consumed. I'm still a big fan of traditional real books. I don't own a Kindle. I'm not have anything against them. Fine. However people are reading is cool with me. But for myself, dead paper, dead trees are still the way to read. But that would seem to lend itself better to the novella as a consumable, right? Than the arduous task of printing something or even POD creating a book and have it sent to market. But it really has been a slow-going process still. Novels are still by and far the most popular form for the genre, even though the novella seems to... whenever I talk to any creative people at any level inside the genre, they all champion novellas. But it seems like the readers are slower on the uptake on this. Any ideas why you think that might be?
Well, I know, like I said, speaking of Poisonous, at that time, apparently novellas were not in style because I had a lot of trouble finding a publisher who would accept that length of a story. Now that was 2011-ish that I sold the story, and in 2012 it came out. But since then, these days novellas, it seems like, are all over the place. So that's people seem to be enjoying it for the most part, enjoying that length of a story. As you might sort of indicated, ebooks, novellas, to me, seem to have become way more popular. I don't know if that really answers the question.
I also wonder if it's just partially financial, because because of what I call the King problem, which is that Stephen King gets all the press, right? People don't know who to turn to for horror outside of him and maybe a few other names if they're a deep reader. But, if you're going to spend $12 on an ebook or $20 on a trade paperback, because there are no more traditional mass market paperbacks to be found on the shelves, are there? Whereas you could come in at a $7 price point. The novella might be the answer to all this. It always felt that way to me.
Perhaps it would be cost-wise, perhaps a bit.
Yeah. Well, it's just, we all have budgets, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to try out a writer, maybe a novella is a good halfway step before you bite the bullet on that $20 trade paperback, right?
Well, I would like to see novellas make a comeback. And I'm really guilty about being that person that downloads everything on Kindle. Like, I've very few physical books in my house, and I would like to change that, but it's definitely a matter of convenience. So bear with me here, because I don't read any novellas for the most part. If you were to print them out, about how many pages are we talking?
Well, you're talking... Yeah. Go ahead.
I consider I consider a novella basically I agree with the Horror Writers Association in the 40,000 words or less to be a novella. So you're going to have slightly over 100 pages. I think what Poisonous may have been around 114-ish, somewhere in there. So probably about that. And that was 30,000 words, so maybe a little more than that.
Okay, so hear me out. What if we find a way to just like hijack like Archie comics? Because, you know, they had the digest and the double digest, just like put novellas in their place. It'd be around the same, probably around the same thickness. They have those at the grocery store all the time. It'd be, you know, just push the novellas there. Just get rid of the Archie comics and swap them out for a bunch of novellas.
Wait. You're saying that your supermarket has Archie's comics?
Yeah.
Wow. Tommy, you seeing Archie's on the checkout line still? Because that left New Jersey, I think, around, I don't know, 2000.
Actually, I have not in a long time around here.
We still have them. I mean, probably not as many as we used to, but that's how I got all of my comics growing up. I started off with those Archie digests. And I mean, those things were super easy to read. And I'm just like, well, why can't we put books in there? I don't know.
You're too young to remember there used to be books there. That's the thing. On the end of it,
yeah.
and probably every third checkout lane, there was a spinner rack of paperbacks. That was kind of where a lot of people did get back in the mass market paperback days.
Yeah.
I'm still baffled about what happened to the mass market paperback, to be completely honest with you.
Yeah, let's bring it back. What happened, Lauren?
Well, it's not up to me. I'd bring them back in a heartbeat. I think the most beautiful thing in the world is a beaten up mass market paperback book that's had 17 owners and has dog-eared pages where every one of those readers stopped reading that day. That's the most beautiful thing in the world to me. I'd love to see them back, but everything's trade paperbacks now. Just is. So society,
I have no response except to suck my teeth.
Society changes so rapidly now, even less with what we were just talking about with just kind of the physical presence of books. But, you know, how as writers do we keep kind of relevant in a world that changes as fast as it does? I mean, we're in a world whereas if you would have asked me when 9/11 happened, I would have said, well, that was, you know, a couple years ago. It's 20 years ago,
Right.
But it feels like a couple years to me.
20-year anniversary is coming up soon.
Right, but it does not feel like 20 years to me. But if you look at how quickly we've changed, the fact that you look at the world of young people is so different than the world of my world even now. I still use a PC. Most young people would laugh at you for buying one. They have their phone and they're good. That's it. Done. So how do we keep current? Because horror depends probably more than any other genre on relatability of the world. You know, all the fears are based on real fears, but exaggerated. So how do we tap into where we are now so we don't write about 10 years ago?
Well, I think there are horror stories everywhere happening in the world. So perhaps we can sit down and watch the news for a little while. Lots of horror material in there. Depressing, perhaps.
Yeah. I can't with this week. Can't.
And we have a lot of technology these days. Of course, you know, that's one of them. That's one aspect of what you're talking about. In my view, technology has just been accelerating at an incredible pace. And so if you've been around for a little while, yes, you notice that for sure. So as for how to tap into that, well, I don't know. Because it's a lot easier for young people than it is for someone who's my age or your age, perhaps. But
my age, perhaps?
Here we go.
I think you might be a bit mistaken, sir.
Well, younger than you or I.
There we go. That's a lot.
Different age than we are.
I think the
Youngster
secret lies in
whippersnapper.
TikTok. TikTok, that's how you keep up with the youths.
Oh,
So
then
I'm
there's
told.
that.
I don't.
TikTok scares the hell out of me.
It should. It's a fucking nightmare from what I've seen. I don't even use it. People just send me TikToks, and I'm like, no.
So it's like we went from people used to go out to the movies to people watching YouTube videos, but no, that was too long. We need to get this shit done in under a minute. That's where we're at socially with the TikTok generation. Scary.
I don't know why I hate TikTok so much, but I miss Vine. That doesn't make any sense.
But, I see young children at some of these conventions walking around with Stranger Things shirts, and they love it. And that was back in horror's heyday. And I'm not saying horror can't have another heyday. There's a lot of good horror that's coming out now, books and films alike. But they're into this, and to us who were around during that time period, there's a lot of nostalgia. But also, I think that's something they did well with Stranger Things, is as far as that sort of going back to the 80s and what have you, trying to recapture that atmosphere. But also it appeals to younger people. So there's so many of them that love it.
And that actually dovetails nicely into Griffith's question. What are your top 3 favorite horror films?
Oh, wow. I have so many favorites. But I typically give Halloween as one of my favorites. That was since early on. The original John Carpenter's Halloween was one of my favorites for sure. I've always been a big fan of Phantasm. Early on, I watched those, and I watched them again later. And when the second Phantasm film, that was really good too. After that, I kind of sort of started, but I really enjoyed the first 2 films. And then, said I have a lot of favorites. We mentioned Stephen King before. He's had a lot of movie adaptations. I enjoyed the book and the film of The Shining, but for different reasons. I mean, there are different animals. If you've read the book and you've watched the film, and Stephen King was not happy with how the film came out. But I still think it's an exquisite movie. It's just it's different from the book. That's all. That's the first 2 I mentioned for sure. The Shining is one of my favorites. It's hard to say top 3, but I'll go ahead and go with that for right now. Just I could pull up a whole list of movies and go down through that. Yeah, those are up there for sure, and Halloween's definitely in the top 3 for me.
All right, not to get political, but I'm going to get political. Candy corn, yay or nay?
Yeah.
I'm a big candy corn fan.
You're rowdy in the chat. I don't know.
But I'm also a guy who prefers red vines to Twizzlers, and I know I get beat up on that all the time. So whatever, we'll move on.
I'm really looking forward to buying Halloween candy. That's all.
I was at a Spirit today.
What?
Yes.
I'm so mad at you. I haven't been to a Spirit yet, and it's almost September.
Yeah, they can't get employees enough to fill the shelves. It was only half filled. A lot of new merch was not. I did get a Ouija planchette that's about this big for the wall. Because cool. I have way too many Ouija boards around this house. So a planchette that's like, I don't know, 10 times its natural size. That's my world.
It's the size of one of the Ouija boards, at least.
Yeah, they're getting open though. They're getting open. It's just taking them a while, but I love the Halloween season like no one's business, as I think everyone watching this probably does too.
Hell yes.
As soon as I heard that, because I've 6 spirits within my 40 minutes that I consider acceptable to go to a spirit, because they're all kind of the same, right? The moment the website said one of them was open, I was like, showering and going. I'm done. So I mean,
I'm gonna have to see if there are any open around here now.
Well, if you want a part-time job, I'm sure they'll hire you right now.
I would love a part-time job, but I don't have enough energy. I'd take it, but I don't have that kind of energy.
Anyway, before your candy corn derailed us into Spirit Halloween.
Hey, that was important.
It was. I'm not saying it wasn't. Tommy, finding a home in the modern publishing world is definitely different than it was when we were both coming up at first. Today, there's the question of small presses versus self-publishing versus mass market publishers versus hybrid presses versus, I hate to say it, vanity presses. I don't know why anyone uses them anymore, but they're out there. They do the job. But so what has been what is your opinion of the whole scene? Where do you think you best fit in? What is your ultimate goal? I mean, what is there a size press that you think would be too big for you? Because I do hear that from a lot of people, that sometimes you get lost on the big guys, whereas you can do better with a larger small press. So where's your ambitions and where's your head at on this?
I could see what they mean by that. I mean, I've had other authors far more experienced and accomplished than I have been as yet talk about, some of that, how the independents, and I'm not going to give his name, but most horror fans have at least heard of him. But that the independents will fight for him like nothing else, like no one else. It's nice to get signed with one of the big publishers, but there's a trade-off with anything you do. So he sort of illustrated that, though, is that the independents, are more care about you a bit more, I suppose. Just bottom line, to the the big publishers are just seeing dollar signs, and if you perform or if you don't, then I mean, certainly it would be wonderful to become signed by one of those. But yeah, it could become a disaster. It could be a good thing. It could ultimately become a disaster. At this point, I don't know, because primarily it's been independent for me, independent publishing houses. And then of course you have those going the self-publishing route. And there are a lot of writers who have accomplished quite a bit, been published by some phenomenal publishers, and they've brought back their back catalog through self-publishing. And of course, they still have their hordes of readers, so they're making a lot more money through their self-published books than they would have with the publisher taking a hefty cut, depending on the publisher as to how hefty that might be. But
yeah, but they're all pretty top heavy.
Yeah.
I'm yet to see a contract that's, topped towards the writer. It just doesn't happen. So I've always felt that it's not just even the size of the press as much as it's working with the right people.
There we go. Bit of light.
Because ultimately with the small presses especially, but even the big presses, it's a matter of like who you're dealing with.
Yes, absolutely.
And so finding the right people is even more important. And that's, I guess, where the value of conventions can come from. Also, just proper networking and finding your own ways to promote yourself that leads to meeting people that you wouldn't otherwise. Has the convention scene been a big part of your world in growing your brand, or is it something that you do to enhance the existing brand?
I would say it has. I mean, it's I've come to know a lot of people in the business through that, and I've come to have projects. I've had projects come to fruition as a result of that. One experience can really snowball into another, and you can be sitting around thinking of something, have an idea. You can set to work on this idea, and you can meet people who can help you to realize this idea in physical form. That's always interesting. And yeah, I think the convention circuit has helped out with a lot of that. I've done a lot of conventions over the years. I mean, it's been several years that, now minus the pandemic years we've had recently. I've done some virtual ones too, though, and that was interesting. StokerCon last year was virtual, and then KillerCon's actually this weekend, and they're virtual. And so, and there are conventions that also you can learn a lot about the craft. Even participating on a panel, even if I participate on a panel with other authors who are newer than I am, and they're just breaking in and they're just putting out their first or second novels or what have you, I can learn something from them because their experiences are different from mine. And of course, you have the seasoned professionals who have been doing it for 20, 30, 40 years and what have you. And of course, there's a lot of wisdom and knowledge to be taken from that because they've been doing it so long. They've seen a lot of change over the years, even more than we have. And so yeah, there's a lot of information to be gleaned from all of that. There's a lot of relationships you can find, a lot of support, and a lot of readers you can reach through all of that. So yeah, I do think it's beneficial, for sure.
Have you ever cosplayed at any of the conventions that you've been at?
Cosplay, you say?
Yeah, or would that be too distracting?
Here we go.
Is there a chance you might cosplay, maybe, in the future?
No, I've had people talk about people cosplaying as their characters. I've never done any such thing.
Don't.
Yeah.
I'm just.
I mean, if I go as me, then everybody knows who I am.
So Sam Sam is just trying to bait me into telling a story about a guy dressed as a pirate with a katana, which I'm not going to do.
I have no idea what you're talking about. You've
Sure
literally never mentioned this to me before. This is seriously, I don't know what you're talking about, dude. This is not a bait question. This is a legit question. You're just the one that went off on the pirate.
Yeah, well.
Well, now you have to tell the story.
No, I'm not telling the story, but that's good. All I'll say is my advice is writers should present themselves for their value, not for anything else they might do.
So
I think cosplaying is great for fans of a property. That's awesome. It shows how much they love it. The point where you're cosplaying is something you created, to me.
Oh, well, what about like if you're just, what if you just cosplayed as something you love? Like can you like be an author and then also cosplay a character you like that you didn't make? Or
I think as part of the confusion here is that there's two different types of what we would call horror conventions. And then there's ones that cross over. There's ones that are, hey, want to meet the third guy that played Michael Myers? And then there's a professional conference, more or less, where creative people come together to kind of to mingle, to meet, to hone their craft, to learn, to develop relationships, maybe meet a publisher at a table, that kind of thing. It's not so much applicable to that first category, which I think people are more aware of, where you go to Monster Mania and, you have a photo with Danielle Harris where she pretends she likes you.
Hey, these are just questions that I need to know because I don't do conventions very often. Very rarely. So I'm curious. I gotta know. I mean, I could actually try and attend one, but that seems like more effort than I would want to put in.
You have a decent amount in your area. You could do that. Yeah.
Frightener weekend, but that's like 5 hours away. Well,
I drove 10 hours to Imaginarium.
Oh, wow. Well, that's almost as much as me. It's, I think, 11 for me.
Ugh.
Wouldn't it have been a shitacular thing if we got into a car accident with each other on the way there?
That would be a story.
It would be a story, and it would not be explainable. So, tell us where we can find your work, how to follow you online or in real life. If you have any events coming up, give us the spiel.
Well, you can find me on my website, of course, is tommybsmith.com. So just make sure to include the B in there. It's a lot easier to find me that way. And then Facebook, author Tommy B. Smith, and Twitter as Pin of Chaos. And I don't know how many more events I'm going to do this year. It's kind of unpredictable with the pandemic and the ebb and flow of the mentality and the virus and all of that. And so I'm sitting back sort of waiting to see what's going to happen. Like I said, I was going to do KillerCon this weekend, so I'll be there virtually. And that's more of a writers conference. But I would like to get out and do some more conventions when the climate is right. So I hope 2022, perhaps. Imaginarium, I'm sure I'll be back there again next year. As for what else, that still remains to be seen, depending on how it goes. And don't follow me in person, please, because
I know, I was thank you. I got that too.
Then I will try to lose you.
Listen, who knew stalking was a crime? This is how you learn, folks. So Dan is saying that he insists that Sam and I dress as pirates at Texas Frightmare.
Okay. That was easy.
I didn't agree to a thing.
I did. I don't know why you can't get on the train, Lauren.
Yeah, no, trains and me have a bad history. Jamie says, hit like if you think Lauren should cosplay at the next
Smash
event.
that
Is never going to happen, Jamie, but thank you for the kind words. And yeah, they should hit like anyway.
Well, smash the like button if you want Lauren to, cosplay. You could just tap the like button like regular if you don't care.
I think these like buttons get abused by people. That's what I think.
Not enough. Not enough for us anyway.
I will say on that note that if you do find yourself in Allentown, Pennsylvania tomorrow at the PA HorrorCon, I will be there just wandering about. I'm not a guest or anything. I'm just going to be there at some point in the afternoon, just taking in the sights. So if you are around and you see me, it's pretty hard to miss me. I'm the short, bald guy. Just come up and say hi. All right. Any final
Don't be
words?
dressed like a pirate. Got it.
I will not be dressed like a fucking pirate. Tommy, any final words?
I'm curious about the trains. Why do you have a bad history with trains?
So more subways and elevated trains in Philadelphia. I did not realize at a very tender age of my concert going that SEPTA trains stopped at midnight. So I had taken trains from Jersey into Philadelphia and then could not get home. So I spent a night with homeless people trying to sell me their shoes, with prostitutes making some suggestions about money I didn't have. And by do you remember the early days of going to concerts? You had exactly the amount of money you needed.
Yeah.
You had enough money. You probably had the ticket in advance because you didn't want to take the chance, but you maybe had enough money for a T-shirt. You might have had enough money for a taxi if you needed it, but there was very little wiggle room. And so the train stopped. It wasn't like I was going to get a room somewhere for the night. No, I was in the train station in Philadelphia overnight, and Philadelphia's an awful city. That's all I can say. Philadelphia is an awful, awful city. And Laundry is asking Steak to sing Billy Joel in Allentown. Sam, what do you got for us?
Not a lot. I mean, I got my teeth cleaned last week, and I got my car inspected, and that's pretty much all I've been up to. That was my staycation. Yeah, it's fascinating.
All right. Well, we will be back a week from today. Actually, we'll be back before then, but we have to announce that at some point. In the meantime, we will be back in a week with author Evie Knight. Nope, that's not correct. I'm looking at the wrong sheet. That was amazing.
That episode.
We did that. That was like a month and a half ago or something. We will be back on the 27th with author Matt Doyle, who will be giving us a sneak look at his mindset for his novel that is coming out the first week of September from our friends over at Fraction Mirror Press. So that'll be an exciting show. In the meantime, keep a lookout on your notifications. Make sure you hit that bell button down below so you get the notifications. I don't even think it works, but do it anyway. Smack it and abuse it like Sam wants you to, because she's all into kinky stuff like that. We will announce a show next week. Just talking genre, we're just ironing out the last few details. So we'll be with you very shortly. In the meantime, everyone, please have a great day.
Bye.
My skin futzed around in the water, driftwood all over the